Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this very important discussion. You will all have seen that we circulated the revised version of the employment equity regulations in February and have called for comments from our members. And we have today, I'm very pleased to say, John Botha from Global Business Solutions, who's going to talk through those proposed changes, what the implications are, what they mean for businesses, the things that you need to consider in terms of calculating the requirements in your businesses and putting your plans together going forward. John is the joint CEO of Global Business Solutions. He spoke recently at BUSA and spoke to us about these regulations, and that was how I came to listen to John and the important messages and the clarity of message that he shared. John is his company, Global Business Solutions, is a national labor law and business consulting firm. And previously, John has held ministerial appointments to the Employment Equity Commission. He was a BUSA lead negotiator at NEDLAC on certain Labour Relations Act amendments. He also represented business at the International Labour Organization Conference in Geneva for 3 years, and the Group Executive HR Director of the largest JSE-listed Workforce Solutions business in South Africa. So please join me in welcoming John. I'm really looking forward to sharing his presentation with you and to learning from his fantastic insights into the challenges in this very, very important space. John, thank you again so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Sam, and good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you. And with that introduction, I'm going to have to step up to the plate and do my best, but it's really, really a privilege to be with you. And thanks again to Sam, Sandra, and Brad for inviting me to spend a bit of time with you and share some thoughts in respect of the environment we find ourselves in. I think just up front to let you know, the presentation will obviously be made available to you. So use the time to immerse yourself in the key insights that we're going to be drawing on. And then we also have an added bonus. The FI, together with us, we've put together a spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet is going to give you the opportunity to do your very own gap analysis, colleagues. So not often you get something useful for free, but we try our best, don't we? Colleagues, I'm going to get stuck into the work of the day. You're welcome to chat in the chat box or have Q&A later on. But effectively, we're looking at the ministerial targets, the regulations that were published on the 1st of February. And of course, this was round 2, the last ones being published last year. And of course, 1st of February, the latest versions. And I will share with you my views in respect of that on timing. Really just to start off at the beginning. What is the context within which we find ourselves as organizations and as individuals? We cannot ignore the context because in my personal view, colleagues, it's not so much the legislation that is the challenge as it is the organizational climate and culture. And I'll expand on that later on, but this is not a time for just management. We need leaders. And we need strong leaders, and I'll explain to you why. Then we will take a look at the legal provisions. Very briefly, the Amendment Act, what are the big ticket items? We'll then get stuck into the work of today, which is the regulations and the targets. We'll specifically consider the financial services sector targets and then open up for Q&A. So let's use this opportunity to collaborate and to share certain insights. Now, colleagues, yes, the law is creating uncertainty, but we can still figure that out. What is more difficult is to create an environment that will result in the results that we are trying to achieve. And what we find when we look at stats later on, we'll see the results have been lacking. And in my experience, in looking at organizations that are struggling to embed employment equity as well as other other strategies in the organizations. The problem is that we often start with the results. We say, these are the targets, these are the outcomes, and just deliver. And of course, it never happens. The reason is, and if we use a psychological underpinning, we use the Lencioni dysfunctions of a team. If ever you're wondering why a team or an organization is not achieving the results that it's looking for, chances are that it is not built on a foundation of trust. Colleagues, trust is manifest in vulnerability, the ability to be who you are. It's to arrive, to ask questions, to even challenge, and to have discussions around the way forward. And of course, employment equity is pregnant. It's heavily loaded with a lot of concerns and doubts and fears and aspirations. And if we don't have that discussion, the next step becomes a problem, because if we don't ventilate these things, we have unhealthy conflict. Healthy conflict is very necessary. I mean, a lot of questions come out of this. You'll see today the regulations from the 1st of February make very, very contentious and specific provisions. And then you're going to have different stakeholders feeling polarized. And by feeling polarized, people are going to feel a lack of commitment. So if they're not heard, and if their concerns are not put into the mix, the outcome is then a lack of commitment to whatever is agreed, a lack of commitment to the employment equity plan, a lack of commitment to your policy, and your behavioral attributes follow. Avoidance of accountability, and how difficult do we find it for line managers in particular to be accountable for their recruitment, their training, their promotion, career and succession planning. And it's often because they're not part of this process, and ultimately, colleagues, the results suffer. So I'm challenging you today. Yes, let's look at the law. It is a task. There is a checklist. But more importantly, the question is, have you created an environment for your teams to function to optimal levels? Do you have the culture and the leadership? Remember, leaders take care. Leaders bother to listen. They care to listen. They empathize. If you don't do that as a leader, and all you do is you try and manage and manage and manage the process to reach the outcomes, I can guarantee you, you're going to have some significant problems. Now, in my experience, this disruption is across all industries and sectors. Not only do we find a raft of labor laws, but everything is characterized by exponentiality. I'm actually running a webinar, the first of its kind, I think, later this month, in terms of human resources and labor relations from an end user perspective. In other words, as HR and our practitioners, how do we use artificial intelligence in recruitment, selection, training, right through to disciplinary inquiries? Did you ever think that a robot would give you insight as to whether or not to dismiss an employee after hearing evidence? I'm training on that later on, but the point I'm making is it stretches us. It continuously challenges our thinking and pushes us out of our comfort zones. And of course, employment equity is just another aspect with technology, with disruption, pushing us out of our comfort zones and saying, how do we come to grips with this change? And it's a very, very quick change. From a labor law point of view, and I posted on LinkedIn this morning, I've updated this spreadsheet or this diagram. But colleagues, this is just a very high-level view of all the laws that are workplace and labor law related coming down the track. Some of them have already been implemented, like the national minimum wage. The pension funds bill comes through in September. And of course, that's the two-pot system, which obviously you're very familiar with, but it requires employers to respond. But of course, today, the big issue is the Employment Equity Amendment Act. Colleagues, as you know, this act has been signed by the president. It's been assented to, although it has not yet been promulgated. And it cannot be promulgated until the regulations, the red coloring has been, or shading has been complied with. So these regulations that were published on the 1st of February, the closing date for submissions is pretty much the end of April. So what you're going to be doing as an association is hopefully consolidating submissions from the membership that can be fed directly to the Department of Labor and consolidated into the Business Unity South Africa and the Black Business Council submissions. So colleagues, we are going to focus on these two areas, but just to bear in mind, all these other laws coming down the track. I mean, who would have thought cannabis for private purposes would allow you to carry 100 grams of dried cannabis in your pocket, in your private person or on your person? 100 grams, that is not seen to be trading in cannabis. It's for private purposes. Of course, you can't bring it onto the workplace, but you're going to have to make that very clear. For those of you who grow cannabis plants, it also talks about how many plants per capita you are allowed in your house. So if you want a lot of Zol, have more people living with you, and you can grow more plants. Anyway, just joking around. Of course, it does provide for that, but labor law can be quite boring. This is a wonderful depiction of the environment in which we find ourselves. This is the Edelman Foundation, and I'd really encourage you to Google Edelman. They do global research on polarization, trust levels, and the like. In this context, you see South Africa at the top right, one of the 6 most highly polarized geographies in the world. And the reason I've included this slide is we have a formula. The formula is connection times task equals results. You can have the best employment equity strategy and plan. You can have the best policies, and it's a task. But if the task is not complemented with connected employees and leaders who understand and buy into it and have transformed in their thinking, you're not going to get the results. I mean, I'm sure you've been to very good doctors, for example, who are the best in their field, but they have the EQ of a dead ant, So we need to connect and address the task. And here we see in South Africa, we're really implementing employment equity in an already divided society. The polarization here is based on economic anxieties. Of course, a lot of people worried about their economic well-being, high interest rates, or inflation starting to drop off, but still being problematic. And then we have real drops in our wages in real terms, institutional challenges, class divides, and then, of course, the battle for the truth. And in the absence of truth, colleagues, we find a deficit and resistance to change. And my biggest concern in employment equity is a lack of trust in organizations. The lack of trust means that people detach, they become distant and resistant. Now, when that happens, if you take a look at the change curve, when people do not have trust in their leadership, if they don't have trust in government, if they don't have trust often in their line managers and their peers, we find that when change takes place, people are resistant. And of course, you've seen this when the employment equity regulations and targets were published. People went into denial. This will never happen. The minister can't set targets for us. Surely not. That eventually became frustration with like Solidarity and the DA litigating and threatening litigation against government, saying you are now perpetuating the imbalances of the past. And it ended up at the ILO, where the International Labour Organization told the South African government and Solidarity to come back to South Africa and come flesh out and find middle ground. So you find this change curve kicking in. And right now, to be quite honest, I believe many, many people, when we talk about employment equity, I wouldn't say they're depressed necessarily, but certainly there's anger, there's fear, and these are emotions. Now, if ever you've had your emotions heightened, you will know it disconnects your rational thinking. So when you lose it in traffic and someone pulls in front of you, your response is irrational. It's because your amygdala has hijacked your rational brain. Your fight, flight, or freeze response kicks in. And this is why emotional intelligence, the connection part of employment equity, is critical. You need to embed leading and managing with emotional intelligence, because you are going to have people come to you and say, this is the biggest lot of nonsense I've ever seen. It's reverse discrimination. What about skills? What about economic well-being? What about this? And others are going to come and say, well, show me the goods. You know, where's my opportunity? And if you are not capacitated to deal with that emotional response, colleagues, your resistance will lengthen this curve and deepen it. In fact, many companies never make it out of this. And of course, we don't have time today, but there are many companies that have failed to transition, not because of new technologies. It's not because of new technology that Kodak isn't around anymore. It's not because of new technologies that Blockbuster is liquidated effectively. It's not because of that, because everyone faces new technologies. Everyone faces change. The difference is, how do you adapt to that change? So it's not the strongest or most intelligent that survive, but those who are the most adaptable. And unfortunately, when it comes to employment equity, there is very, very low levels of cognitive flexibility. So what we're going to try today is create a bit of a framework for you to work from in order to ensure we move forward. And colleagues, you might say, but John, we didn't come here today for a psychology lecture. Colleagues, Section 15, 1.5 of the Employment Equity Act says employers must take measures under affirmative action measures. It says employers must take measures to further diversity. And colleagues, the furthering of diversity can only be underpinned by trust and emotional intelligence. Very important. Behavior change takes time. Well, let's take a look at the big ticket items in terms of the legislation. If we look at the time frame, of course, the Employment Equity Act kicked in 1998. Over 2 decades, at a very high level, if we look at the progress or the lack thereof, we see, colleagues, in 20 years, very, very unjustifiable and poor progress. So if you look at African representation, for example, across South Africa at top management, it moved from 6 to 17%. That's African representation at top management, which is 11%, which over 2 decades means 0.5% a year. If we look at women, 13 to 26%, a very similar trend, with only 0.5% or just north of 0.5% transformation every year. Now, the concern is that insufficient progress is unjustifiable in many respects. That results in the Minister of Employment and Labour saying, well, you know what? If you as employers are setting soft targets, and if you're not committed, if your behavior does not reflect your commitment, I'll set targets for you. And of course, that is what we're sitting with right now. In the red, you'll see the ministers set 5-year targets between now and 2029. The minister retains the fines of 1.5 million or 2% of turnover, whichever is the greater, but now supplements that with a code of practice on harassment. And I again go back to behavior. Let me share with you an example. Shoprite Checkers, a female assistant, orders clerk, receiving online orders. She battles with a particular order. She calls in her male manager. The male manager comes in, stands next to her, and then decides that he needs to smack her on the buttocks. He smacks her on the buttocks. It ends up in the labor court. And ultimately, it's not the manager who is issued with a fine of 50,000 Rand, but Shoprite Checkers. Why? Well, because Shoprite couldn't prove that it had taken in those days the appropriate measures to proactively eliminate and prevent harassment. They hadn't done a harassment risk assessment. They hadn't looked at different grievance procedures, because often the perpetrator is the immediate manager. And the reason I'm going there about harassment is In the new Employment Equity Act, you could meet all your targets, but still be found guilty of harassment in the preceding 12 months and still not get your certificate of compliance. And that's where the amygdala hijack, that's where personal mastery comes into it. Because all of us have got values, beliefs, and backgrounds, and ultimately in a work environment, and just from a moral and ethical point of view, we need to self-regulate. So you've got an obligation to ensure that your leaders, your managers, your employees are capacitated in personal mastery. Of course, the amendments to the Employment Equity Act also implement Section 53, which talks about issuing of certificates of compliance, without which you cannot tender for government work and potentially private sector work. Currently, there are also discussions that if you do not get your employment equity compliance certificate, chances are the BE codes will be amended to stipulate that your management control element cannot be verified. So just like skills development in your BE codes, if you don't have a workplace skills plan and training report, you don't get your points. The same is being discussed right now, the BE Commission, that if you don't have an employment equity certificate, you will then not be verified under management control. So massive penalties, economic as well as legislative penalties. So we're now sitting with the employment equity regulations, which talk about consolidated numbers, and we're going to dip into this. But I wanted to share this with you to give you a framework for understanding and getting insight into why the targets have become necessary. And of course, the Employment Equity Amendment Act, which has been signed by the President in Section 15, capital A, stipulates that the minister can now put in place, if you look at subsection 2, targets for any national economic sector. Now, of course, the big challenge here is that finance and insurance is a broad sector. And unfortunately, there's no due consideration of the nuances within the different subsectors. The same with manufacturing. Samantha and Sandra and Brad and I were chatting yesterday, and manufacturing covers automotive manufacturing, food manufacturing, clothing. So what the minister is being accused of is not going into the subsectors and looking at rational target setting based on the realities. But nonetheless, Section 15 has been promulgated. And I often get asked the question, John, do you think this is really going to happen? Well, colleagues, this law has been assented to. It's going nowhere. It's effectively just waiting for a promulgation date. The other thing I want to point out, which many people miss, at the bottom left, Section 42, in other words, the DG review, the first thing that the inspectors are going to look for when they knock at your door under the new dispensation is whether or not the employer has complied with the sectoral targets in terms of Section 15. So every year when you are inspected, the first thing they're going to ask for is, did you or did you not meet your targets for that particular year? It takes away all those little gray areas like, oh, we didn't have skills, we didn't have this. The first point of departure is, did you meet it or not? Of course, Section 53 then talks about issuing a certificate. Now, on the bottom right-hand side, very important, and this is in the regulations as well, is there are 7 justifiable reasons for not meeting your targets. So once it's been established every year that you submit your EEA2, or when you are subject to a DG review, when it's established under Section 42 that you haven't met your targets, you only, colleagues, have 7 grounds for justification. So you're going to have to select one of these: insufficient recruitment or promotion opportunities, insufficient targeted individuals with the right skill sets, a court order, mergers, acquisitions, or transfers of business, or business interruptions like riots, like COVID-19, like cyber attacks. You would have to adduce evidence to this effect. So at the end of next year, when you submit your first year's achievement of targets, end of 2025, if you haven't met your targets for that year, there'll be a system requirement that says, if you haven't met your targets, which of these reasons do you cite for not having achieved that? What will then happen is they'll put you on a list of non-compliance, and obviously you will then become subject to some form of review or inspection. They won't not issue your certificate. You'll still get your certificate. But if they knock at your door and they're not satisfied with your reasons, well, then you're going to lose your certificate. I'm not going to touch on this, but I just want to talk about harassment. Remember, there are two ways you cannot get your certificate of compliance. The one is you don't meet your numerical targets. The other one is you do what happened in the Shoprite case. If you're found guilty of any form of unfair discrimination, including harassment, in the 12-month preceding your certificate, you won't get that certificate. So you need to address qualitative and quantitative aspects in order to avoid the consequences of not getting a certificate. Now, I've just included this slide. I'm not going to go through it, but it gives you the circumstances on the right-hand side when you will not get a certificate. In other words, what shortcomings can result in you not getting a certificate? And on the left-hand side, what are the consequences of not getting a certificate? So that's purely some additional information. Well, why don't we get stuck into the regulations? I mean, that's effectively why we're here. So let's take a look. These are the regulations, colleagues, that were published on the 1st of February. As I said earlier, the submission date for comments, end of April. And I want to just give you my personal view. Having read these regulations, what I think you should be looking out for. My first insight is that they seem complex and tighter than previous regulations. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, when you read the narrative, when you read the 3 pages of text, they've got this hidden complexity. You know, there's a lot of words, and the words are very, very weighted. And then they are tighter than previous regulations. In other words, even though there's a qualitative description, the consequences are very specific numerical impact. The regulations are drafted broadly, but with specific implications. So they say employers should do something, but must take into account the EAP. So they've got a broad statement, but then a specific directive to have an EAP focus. They differentiate between setting targets and compliance evaluation. And that's important. I'm going to come back to this. The target setting process is very prescriptive. You cannot set targets that are gray in maybe setting low targets for the first 3 or 4 years and then a big jump in the last year. You've got to set targets that are very, very specific under the regulations, and they give you prescriptive instructions on how to set targets. Then, if you don't meet the targets, the compliance evaluation is where the justifications come in. Be careful and deliberate. Start planning and get it right now. So what I've done, colleagues, is I have extracted what I believe are the 3 most telling regulation provisions in the codes, in the regulations that were published on the 1st of February. These 3 are game changers. So let's look at the first one. Employers should not set targets for those groups whose representation have already exceeded their EAP in a particular occupational level. So in plain English, they're saying that if you look at your workforce profile, if you've got a race and gender grouping who are already at a higher percentage than the economically active population, you should not set higher targets for them. In other words, for the next 5 years, that group stays as is. Now, I want you to think of the consequences of that. I want you to think of organizations with career and succession plans where they've been working on career and succession across groups, across race and gender groupings. Now the regulations come in and say, but if you're overrepresented already, you can't go higher until you've achieved the targets. The second provision, where a designated employer has exceeded the set numerical target. In other words, where you have already exceeded in the next 5 years, let's say you exceed the minister's target for a particular race or gender group at an occupational level, look at what it says. It says you may not regress. So it says if the target's 50%, African, for example, and you exceed that in the next 5 years, you can't go backwards 49, 48, 45. If you've achieved it, you can't go backwards. On the contrary, it says you should then move towards the EAP. So in other words, the ministerial targets are a minimum, which was not previously articulated in that manner. In the previous regulations, the targets were the targets. And as long as you achieve the targets in the next 5 years, well, then you are safe. But now they're saying those targets are a minimum, and if you exceed them during the 5-year period between now and 2029, you can't stop. You've got to then move towards or you should move towards the EAP. And then the third one I wanted to raise is about how you go about setting targets. Remember, I said they're very prescriptive in how you set your targets. It says designated employers must do 3 things. Firstly, look at your workforce profile, which is your as is. Look at the 5-year ministerial targets, which is your 2B, and then the applicable economically active population, which must be taken into account. So it's very simple. Step 1, what is your as is? Step 2, what is the ministerial target? Step 3, when you put those numbers together across your race and gender groupings, you better align it with the EAP proportionally. And that's interesting because you'll see in the previous format, when they set targets previously, I'm going to jump ahead a bit, but remember the previous regulations, they set very specific targets. So the red, obviously previous, financial and insurance, top management, and they would literally say African male 26.1, African female 18.5, colored male. They would give you the detail. Now they've taken that away and they've replaced it with a broad number. They call it designated groups. And they say designated groups at top management for financial and insurance. They say designated groups, 26% male, 20% female, overall 46%. So you see, colleagues, that's what they're saying. They're saying in the regulations, they're saying, look at your as is, look at your 2B, but in any case, break it down into the sub-race and gender groups that show the EAP. I really battle to understand it because they're still actually asking you to have the detailed sub-race and gender proportionality requirements. So, colleagues, these are 3 game changers, primarily because at least the first 2 were not previously in the regulations. So let's take a look at what this means diagrammatically. 3.4.2, which I've just covered in the previous slide, says step 1, set your targets. Look at your as is versus your ministerial targets. Then once you've done that and you've broken them down proportionately to align with the EAP at sub-race and gender level, then you start the process, the 5-year process. Then, where you exceed the EAP, you do not increase those targets. And then, of course, if you meet the targets during the 5 years, you move towards the EAP. The second part is now when you report annually, or the DG arrives and knocks at your door and says, right, okay, John, let's see, have you achieved your targets? And if I say, no, we haven't achieved our targets, I then lead evidence in respect of one of these 7 justifiable reasons. Very briefly, I want to impress on you, colleagues, this will require you to have a deviation policy in your organization. So every position that you target for a particular race and gender group that you cannot fill with that particular race and gender group, you're going to have a deviation policy that shows that you addressed certain checkpoints before making a deviation in your appointment. You're going to have to look at your responses, the race and gender mix of those respondents, why you didn't shortlist them, why they were not appointed, and so on and so forth. And you're going to have to go through a protocol so that at the end of the day, you can justify one of these 7 reasons. So it's going to require quite a lot of record keeping. If we take a look at the targets from a different perspective, paragraph 3.4.6 of the regulations, remember it says at management levels, right, there are ministerial targets to be achieved by 2029, but they are minimum. And if you achieve them during the 5 years, you can't regress and you need to move towards the EAP. So it's a very forward-looking, progressive directive. It says you can't rest on your laurels. And even if you exceed the ministerial targets, you can't stop there. You've got to move then towards your economically active population. Now, when we take a look at the definitions here, colleagues, if we look at the definition of designated groups, it's very important because designated groups, as we know in the Employment Equity Act, means Black people, women, and people with disabilities. In other words, Black people is African, Indian, and colored colleagues. Women includes white women and Black women. And people with disabilities includes white people with disabilities and Black people with disabilities. And this is a big shift because if you take a look at the targets, colleagues, take a look at the targets previously. The targets previously were based on race, African, colored, and Indian. That was the previous determining factor of your particular targets. It did not include white women and white people with disabilities. Now they've changed it. The regulations now say we are setting targets for you, not for Black individuals, but for designated groups. In other words, they're now including white women, they're including white people with disabilities. Very important, because if you previously looked at it, take a look at this example on the screen. If we look at top management at the total column for national, 44.6%, 5.2 and 1.5. If you added those up, they would have generally added up to the targets, the 51.3. Now they're saying, no, the target is 46, and it's based on the designated group calculation. So it's a big shift in terms of the calculation of your targets because it's now not based on Black individuals, it's now based on designated persons. So let's contextualize this and start pulling it through to the targets. Colleagues, there are still 18 sectors. Of course, financial and insurance have got 1,146 designated employers in this sector, representing just over 400,000 employees. And what's important to realize is that you are very soon going to have ministerial targets for the sector, and you're going to have 1,146 designated employers vying for the talent in that sector, because each and every one of them are going to have to strive to achieve their targets. And unless organizations have got very good workforce planning, human capital planning strategies in terms of entry-level careers and succession planning and retention, you're going to have major challenges, because there's going to be a big deficit in terms especially of African males and females. Interestingly enough as well, when you take a look at the biggest barriers to employment equity across these, if you look at the bottom of this, 27,000 companies that report every year on employment equity, the biggest barriers have got in one way or the other to do with the front end: recruitment, succession planning, advertising of positions. In other words, the talent management cycle is going to be under even more pressure as companies have got a big deficit over the next 5 years. What I find very concerning, though, is that corporate culture is only listed as the 6th highest barrier. And we know that culture is a manifestation of the collective behavior of organizations. So if companies are not recruiting, selecting, training, career and succession planning, that tells me it's not a matter of task, it's a matter of connection. You see, behavior is underpinned by mindsets which are underpinned by values and beliefs and backgrounds. And as long as organizations fail to get their leaders and managers to lead and manage with emotional intelligence, we're going to continue having culture undermining this entire process in organizations. In your notes that you're going to get from Sam and Sandra and Brad are the very latest EAP stats. Isn't that exciting? You can just imagine how boring one's life must be when you get excited to have an early view of the latest EAP. So there you have it. Very boring life that I do lead indeed. But just because this is an upfront view, I'm privileged to have access to these stats. They will be published in the Employment Equity Commission report. But these are the very latest national EAP stats. So these are important, colleagues, because in the regulations, remember, let's see why the EAP is important. It says, if a group at an occupational level exceeds the EAP, you should not set targets for that group. So let's say you've got too many white females relative. What's white female in terms of the national EAP? Look where my cursor is. 3.5% of South Africa's national EAP are white women, right? So anything more than 3.5% white women at any occupational level means you shouldn't increase their numbers over the next 5 years. Simple as that. That's why the EAP is so important. Secondly, when setting targets, designated persons must be targeted in alignment with the EAP. So these proportional representations need to find their way into your targets. They've got to be proportional and rational. And then the third reason the EAP is important is that even if you meet the ministerial targets, you cannot regress during the 5 years, and you need to go towards the EAP. Critical. So you've almost got a starting point, a ministerial target point, and then if you achieve that, you don't stop there, you move towards these numbers on the screen. And of course, we also have it for you per province. Good. So, colleagues, let's take a look at the regulations of the 1st of February. There's your sector, financial and insurance. And there they give you your targets, 26% male, 20% female, designated groups as per the definition in the Employment Equity Act. Designated groups does not mean African, Indian, and colored. It includes women, both white and black, people with disabilities, both white and black. Now the challenge is, how on earth do we go about setting these particular targets? Well, we knew that you would ask that question, so we put together this little spreadsheet, as we said, which you will receive. It's purely a tool to help you do scenario planning and to establish the gaps. So let me give you a very quick orientation in respect of how to use this spreadsheet. You'll see it's got a drop down. So you're going to be able to select national or regional EAP, depending on whether you are primarily, most of your employees are in one province, or if you're in multiple provinces. And that's a great thing the regulations have done, is they've said to you, if 51% of your employees are in one province, you can choose either to use that province EAP, provincial EAP, or national. But once you've made your election, you've got to stick to it. So it's at least clarified that. So colleagues, in the spreadsheet, you'll see what we have done is we've allowed this line over here, and these white spaces are for data capture purposes. So you would insert your as is. So top management, let's say this is your company, you have 3 colored males and 3 white males. So in other words, there's 6 people at top management. It then allows you to forecast over the next 5 years and say, by 2029, how many African males will we have? Because we currently have 0, we'll end at 1. And colored males, we've currently got 3, we envisage 1, maybe 2 are retiring. White males, we currently got 3, and we're going to stick with 3. Because remember, you can't go to 4 white males because they already exceed the national EAP. White males are already at 50%. The EAP is 4.2. So remember, you can't go to 4 or 5 white males. You can't go to 4 or 5 colored males because they're already exceeding that green line, the EAP. What we then do, colleagues, is you can do scenario planning, and it tells you how you stack up against the EAP. Colleagues, the next important line is the sectoral targets, or are the sectoral targets. Now, the sectoral targets depict the designated person's definition. In other words, African male in your sector need to be 22.64% by 2029. Colored males, 2.52, and Indian males, 0.84. And of course, it carries on. And you'll see there's even a target for white females. Why? Because white women are part of the designated group, but it's been done on an adjusted representation basis. In other words, what we did was we took the EAP for African male, for example, but we removed the white male 4.2%. So if you remove 4.2% from 100%, you come to 95.8%. So the denominator is no longer 100%. The denominator is 95.8% because you've removed white males because they are not part of designated groups. You then work your 43.1% African male not over 100, but over 95.8, which gives you your 44.99%. So that, colleagues, 44.99% times the ministerial target will give you the 22.64. So this yellow line is the line which is your ministerial target. So if we look at African males in this example, they're currently 0. You need to plan in the red line to have 2 African males by 2029. That's how the spreadsheet works. We then pull it through to senior management, middle management, and of course to junior management. Now, of course, I am talking a huge amount, so I'm going to stop shortly. Colleagues, these are just some of the early submissions that business are making to the minister. They are saying to the Minister of Labour that, for example, in the finance sector, there are very specific factors that impact the availability of skills and talent that have not been taken into account. It talks about the fact that you can't exceed if you already exceed your EAP, you can't set higher percentages. And of course, that is tantamount to an absolute exclusion of non-designated people, which is contrary to the Employment Equity Act. Then they talk about the fact that moving towards the national EAP or the provincial EAP, if you achieve the targets, has got significant challenges because companies are going to battle to hold on to their skills in light of the massive shortfall and demand in the labor market. It also talks about the fact that there's a lot of discretion that is given to the DG and to the inspectors during reviews, and that discretion needs to be put into a court process if possible. Designated groups, very important to just get clarity on, is it designated groups or is it black individuals as defined? And we're very clear, we have engaged with the Minister of Employment and Labour, and the Minister said it's the definition in the Act, but we've got to be clear and it's got to be written into the regulations. Then we get to the subsector realities, that subsectors have got different nuances, and ultimately, colleagues, that the process that the Department of Labour follow, if you do not achieve your targets, must be clarified. In other words, what can organizations expect if they fail to achieve their annual targets? What process and what appeals and what protocols can they expect off the back of that? So, colleagues, with that in mind, I'm going to hand back to Sandra and Sam, and my apologies for overshooting, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
John, I can only say thank you so much. I think just as my experience during the BUSI presentation, I think you articulate all of these changes and all of these provisions so well. But before I open the floor to any other questions from other members, and I'm sure there will be some, is perhaps you could just briefly discuss now, obviously there were specific provisions around the provincial and the national targets, and that has now currently been removed. What is the situation where we've got a national employer, but the bulk of their employees, for example, sit in Natal? Which do you then choose? Do you choose the national, or do you choose the provincial, or you could choose both, or do you have to stick with one? Perhaps you could just give some clarity there before I open the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Sam, for raising that. Colleagues, that's one of the positives. They've clarified that. Let's assume you've got 100 employees and 51 of them are in KZN. You've got an option. You can either stick with the KZN EAP, which is on the screen, or let's say you got 51 in KZN and 30 in the Western Cape and the balance in the Eastern Cape. You can either choose KZN because that's where the majority are, or you can choose national. It's your election, but once you've made your election, you've got to stick with that over the next 5 years. So the mere fact that you're across different geographies and provinces doesn't mean you've got to go national. If the majority of your employees are in one province, you can go provincial. Thanks.
That's great, John. Thank you so much. Jessica, I see you have a question in the chat and you have a hand up. I'm not sure if it's the same question and you'd like to ask it specifically of us and of John.
Yes.
Sorry, Jessica, you put yourself on mute.
There we go, I'm unmuted. I wanted to find out just with this specific case, I'm at a holding company level, and we've got about 7 FSPs below us, again, across South Africa, same instance. Do we run this, can we run this at a holding company level, or does it have to be at an individual FSP level?
Jessica, you again have an option. You could consolidate it at a group level,
Okay.
and your submissions could be at a group level. But in terms of the codes of practice, you still have to have individual plans and analyses. The EA 12s and 13 still have to be for the separate sub-holding companies, but you can consolidate your report at a national level.
Okay.
So that's generally the approach.
And
It also,
just while
yeah.
I'm speaking to you, sorry, John, I just wanted to find out, do you have because I've often found it that these new regulations come out, we have to reach these requirements. So the most recent one I can think of is when we had to FICA existing clients by a certain amount of time, but then we aren't given any resources of, well, this is a company that you can outsource to do it, or these are individuals. Is there any sort of support? Do we outsource this? Is it worth it to upskill someone internally? Because while I understand that this might be an easy activity for some, obviously there's those of us in the FSPs where we don't have this type of knowledge and this type of expertise that you have.
Yeah. Jessica, and your point is well made. And I think the world we live in is open for collaboration, so I would definitely get someone in the know to give me a framework strategy view. Someone that
Yes.
can come do a desktop analysis and say to you, rather keep it at consolidated group level or break it down to sub-holdings level, because imagine if you don't get a certificate of compliance at a holdings level.
Yes.
Then all companies could potentially be prejudiced for procurement points of view, etc. So someone needs to come look at your structure, give you a sense of how to mitigate your risk, and then to give you the nuts and bolts, and then you can run with that and monitor that internally. But it's always good to collaborate and to get other views. So
When
that's,
you say someone, is that someone new?
I'd love to help you, but I don't want to overstep the boundary, but I'm absolutely available to assist you if I can.
I think that's the biggest frustration, is that we're told, okay, you need to do this, but then it's, well, we need support. So now knowing, for example, that this is something that your company does or other individuals do, for us to quickly jump to it and become compliant, I think we have to outsource quite quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, to try and upskill is not an option. So I think more from my side, why I enjoy attending these FIA meetings is because as an organization, I feel that we should be more reliant on each other of, oh, by the way, this company does this if you need assistance.
Jessica, just to say, we are absolutely giving out John's details as part of this.
Woo-hoo.
And you can certainly reach out to Global Business Solutions and John and his team. They are included on the presentation. And so, as mentioned by Sandra at the outset, we will be sharing those with everyone, and most certainly give you that opportunity to reach out to the experts. I'm very mindful of time, but
yes.
If you wouldn't mind, John, would you be willing to answer one more question?
I'm fine for the next 10 minutes or so. So
Fantastic.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We've just got a question in the chat from the chair of our Transformation Exco, just asking me if you can give some clarity around the issues of penalties for non-compliance. Will the certificate of compliance be issued per annum? And then so if you don't comply 1 year, you don't get a certificate, and then the following year you might get a certificate, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So this slide on the screen depicts exactly what the state of affairs would be. So remember your as is. What we are expecting, given the information we have, is that the regulations, as we know, the submissions close end of April. Department of Labor will go through the election period, and we're expecting the promulgation of the Act and the regulations in Q3 of this year. It has to be done, obviously, before September. So if we take a look at that, we will be here on the far left, Q3 2024. So the end of 2025 will be your first year that you've either met or not met your targets. Then 26, 27, 28. In answering the question, it's an annual assessment. So Your certificate of compliance is issued every year. Okay, so the platform that the Department of Employment and Labour will use, they're going to have your preloaded targets. Okay, of course, your 5th year, 2029, you've got no discretion because the 5th year is the ministerial target. But in the intervening 4 years, you're going to set your own targets. And every year, the system will then look at a deviation. You said you'd be here, you haven't achieved it, and the system will then require you to use one of those 7 reasons to justify. So your certificate, colleagues, will be issued every year. And remember, if you're found guilty of any form of unfair discrimination in the preceding 12 months, you also won't get your certificate. So that's important. So the penalties will be potential annual penalties, i.e., one of the penalties will be, for example, no access to public sector tenders, possibly even exclusion from the private sector, because we know that procurement departments are very, very, very hectic. So even though by law they don't have to exclude you, you're going to have private companies still asking for your compliance certificate and potentially excluding you. You're going to have JSE listed companies having reporting pressures. You still have the fines which are 1.5 million or 2% of annual turnover, whichever is the greatest. So if someone litigates and says your company is dragging its feet, your company is not implementing its plan, if the Labour Court finds that that is in fact the case, you could face those fines. And then, of course, I mentioned the exclusion from your management control points. So you know, it's very, very significant. And these would be effectively, they would be annual sanctions that could be imposed.
Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate that. I'm going to take one last hand from Paul, and then we will look to close out the session. Paul, over to you.
Thank you excuse me. Thank you very much. The timing of these regulations, I think, is significant because we are in election year. We have a ruling party that is under immense threat, losing its majority. And my question is that they appear to be very populist in nature. And what are the chances that, should they be litigated against, which I think they will be, that these regulations could pass constitutional muster?
Paul,
That's my question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Paul, let's add the National Health Insurance Bill, which apparently the president's looking for a pen to sign off.
Yes.
We've got the land reappropriation or expropriation of land bill, which is also effectively ready to be implemented. And then you've got, you know, the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, etc. And no doubt the timing is definitely not coincidental. But you have to still balance that against the realities of the poor progress that's been made. So on the one hand, the numbers speak for themselves and the need for some form of improvement in the legislation. But on the other hand, they have gone, in my view, a step beyond what would be, I don't know how to put it, legally defensible, because remember, Solidarity and government struck a deal. They signed an agreement, and in that agreement, there were various conditions attached to going forward. And I must say, my personal view is there's some aspects of these regulations which seem to go beyond that agreement that was agreed between Solidarity and government. Will there be litigation? Guaranteed there will be litigation. Will it stay the implementation of the Act? The answer is no. So the Act will be promulgated. The litigation can potentially follow around constitutionality and who knows what not. But please, that's why I emphasize the Act has already been assented to. It just needs to be promulgated. Will there be litigation? Yes, I'm sure there will be. But it will not, you know, as I said, it will not suspend the implementation and enforcement of the Act. So, yeah, good question. Definitely necessary, but there are aspects of populism attached to it.
John, I can't thank you enough. It really has been an exceptional presentation. I think you have put across some very technical and challenging points to our members in a very clear and concise manner, and really honed in on the key elements that they need to think about. A reminder to our members, please, we have issued that call for comments, and we're looking to consolidate them and make our FIA submissions, but also to support the boost submission, which will also be going in. So please do have a look at our questions that we've raised for you, and send us back those returns. And then also, as we've noted previously, we will be sending you all of John's details with the presentation, as well as the Excel spreadsheet that they've kindly put together and given us the opportunity to share with members. So please join me in thanking John very, very much for his time and the input today. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Thanks so much. Sandra, over to you.
Thank you, Sam, and Brad, John especially. I think it's a very complicated matter, but that's probably the simplest presentation I've seen in terms of clarity and giving us that information. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. I'll make sure to share that presentation with you during the course of this afternoon. Please enjoy the rest of your week, and thank you again for everybody for participating. Thank you, Samantha. Enjoy your holiday.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Bye.